Shaq barely stepped out of his Rolls Royce when a smug voice cut through the air. "This isn't a basketball court, big guy. You don't belong here." The crowd of billionaires chuckled, eyes filled with quiet arrogance. But Shaq didn't flinch. He just smiled, adjusting his sunglasses. What he did next would leave them all speechless and completely destroy the man who dared to doubt him. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Shaquille O'Neal stepped out of his sleek, jet-black Rolls-Royce, the low purr of the engine fading into the hush that fell over Silver Ridge Estates. He wasn't surprised. He had felt these kinds of stares before, the kind that weren't just curious but assessing, judging, deciding. The towering iron gates of Silver Ridge had opened for him, but the people inside, they weren't as welcoming. This wasn't just a neighborhood. It was an exclusive billionaire enclave, where wealth wasn't enough. You had to be their kind of rich, the kind that came with lineage, generations of power, and unspoken rules about who belonged. Shaq adjusted his gold-framed sunglasses, scanning the pristine cobblestone driveway leading to the Silver Ridge Realty office. The massive modern building gleamed under the afternoon sun, all glass walls and sharp angles. Inside, well-dressed men and women whispered in hushed tones, exchanging glances as he stepped through the door. He was used to attention. But this was different. Before he could take another step, a voice sliced through the room like a knife. "You lost, big guy." Shaq turned to the source of the arrogance, Richard Davenport III. Everything about him screamed old money. The way he adjusted his platinum cufflinks, the way his designer suit looked custom-fitted to a body that had never lifted anything heavier than a cocktail glass. The smirk that dripped with entitlement. Davenport leaned against the front desk, arms crossed. "This isn't a basketball arena." His voice was calm, condescending. "We have standards here." Shaq let the words hang in the air for a moment. He could feel the weight of a dozen eyes watching, waiting, some amused, some uncomfortable. He took a slow step forward, his towering 7 feet 1 inch frame making Davenport seem almost laughably small. Then he casually removed his sunglasses, revealing a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Standards?" Shaq's voice was smooth, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. His gaze flickered to the massive real estate listings displayed on a digital board behind the desk. "I'm here to buy." Davenport chuckled, shaking his head as if Shaq had just told a joke he didn't quite understand. "You sure about that?" he asked, his smirk widening. "Because that would be a very expensive mistake." Shaq didn't blink. "Good thing I don't make mistakes." The tension in the room thickened. Rebecca, the sales agent behind the desk, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had seen powerful men walk through these doors before, but none quite like this. And certainly none who had Richard Davenport this rattled. Davenport's smirk faltered for half a second before he regained his composure. "We'll see about that," he murmured, eyes narrowing. Rebecca's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her expression tight as she avoided looking directly at Shaq. The tension in the room had settled thick and heavy, pressing down on her like a weight. She had been selling homes in Silver Ridge Estates for nearly a decade, but this wasn't just another transaction. This was a power play, and she knew exactly who was in control. Davenport moved first. He stepped in front of Rebecca's desk, his tailored suit barely shifting as he slid between Shaq and the listing. His smirk had grown sharper, more deliberate. He didn't even glance at Rebecca as he spoke. "I'll handle this one." Shaq's eyebrows lifted slightly. He turned his head, glancing at the massive digital screen behind Rebecca. Rows of mansions lined the display, each one a fortress of wealth and status. Without hesitation, he lifted a finger and tapped the glass. "I'll take this one." Silence. It wasn't just any house. It was the largest estate in the community, 15,000 square feet of pristine luxury, sitting on 5 acres of manicured land. A property designed not just for comfort, but for dominance. The kind of house that made a statement before a single word was spoken. Davenport let out a low chuckle, shaking his head as if Shaq had just misread the entire situation. "That property isn't available." He turned back, meeting Shaq's eyes with a smirk. "For you." Rebecca flinched. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but Shaq caught it. He shifted his gaze to her, and for a split second, she looked like she wanted to say something, anything. Her mouth opened. "Actually, it's still on the Davenport didn't let her finish. "Not anymore." His voice was smooth, final, the kind of tone that came with years of entitlement, of never being challenged. His gaze never left Shaq's, watching for a reaction. Shaq exhaled slowly through his nose, his massive frame impossibly still. He studied Davenport, his smirk unwavering, Then slowly, he tilted his head to the side, considering. So that's how it's going to be? Rebecca swallowed hard, her hands gripping the edge of the desk. Davenport didn't move. He just smiled. Shaq's fingers drummed lightly against the counter before he finally stepped back. He gave one last glance at the mansion listing, then at Davenport. A slow grin spread across his face. All right, he said, voice calm. Let's play. The atmosphere inside the real estate office shifted the moment Shaq walked in. There was an unspoken tension, a weight in the air that hadn't been there moments ago. The employees behind the sleek marble desk exchanged quick glances, their smiles tight and forced. A few of the other clients in the waiting area stole subtle, measuring looks at him, as if trying to determine whether he belonged in a place like this. Shaq, however, remained unfazed. He had been in enough rooms like this to recognize what was happening. He had seen that same quiet discomfort before, the barely concealed judgment of people who believed wealth wasn't enough, that status was something inherited rather than earned. Still, he played it cool. Hands in his pockets, he approached the front desk with an easy stride, his massive frame dwarfing everything around him. He tapped a knuckle against the polished surface, drawing the attention of Rebecca, the real estate agent who had greeted him moments ago. I'll take that one, he said, nodding toward the high-end listing on the screen behind her. It was the largest estate in Silver Ridge, sprawling across acres of pristine land, with a private lake and a mansion that resembled something out of a billionaire's dream. Rebecca hesitated. Before she could respond, a shadow moved beside her, and suddenly Richard Davenport III was stepping forward, smoothly inserting himself between them. Davenport exuded the quiet arrogance of a man who had never heard the word no in his life. Dressed in an expensive, tailored suit that likely cost more than most people's annual salary, he carried himself with the confidence of old money, wealth that had been passed down for generations, the kind that didn't like outsiders. A slow smirk curled on his lips as he regarded Shaq with thinly veiled amusement. I'll handle this one, Rebecca, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Shaq didn't move, didn't react. He simply studied the man in front of him, already knowing exactly where this was going. Davenport clasped his hands together. You see, he continued, that particular property isn't available for you. Rebecca flinched. Actually, she interjected, her voice hesitant, it's still on the market. Davenport didn't even glance at her. He raised a single finger, silencing her mid-sentence. Not anymore, he said smoothly. Shaq let the moment hang between them. The game was clear now. This wasn't just about money. It was about control, about keeping certain people in and others out. Slowly, he tilted his head, his expression unreadable. So that's how it's gonna be? Davenport's smirk widened as he crossed his arms, leaning in slightly as if he had already won. That's exactly how it's gonna be. That night, Richard Davenport III sat at the head of his grand mahogany dining table, a glass of vintage wine in hand, his smirk lingering as he recalled the encounter at the real estate office. The dining room was adorned with gold accents, an extravagant chandelier hanging above, casting a warm glow over the perfectly set table. Across from him, his wife Eleanor delicately sliced her steak, but she wasn't smiling. She had seen that expression on her husband before, the smugness of a man who believed he had won before the game had even started. You should have seen his face, Davenport chuckled, swirling the wine in his glass. The great Shaquille O'Neal, thinking he could just waltz in and buy his way into our neighborhood. I shut him down before he even had a chance. Eleanor pursed her lips, setting her fork down with a soft clink. Richard, she said evenly, are you sure that was a good idea? Davenport scoffed. Oh, please, what's he gonna do? Cry about it on TV? Maybe buy a house somewhere else? He doesn't belong here, and I made sure he knows it. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. You don't think he might push back? Davenport waved a dismissive hand. Honey, this isn't a basketball court. This is my world. He doesn't have the right connections, the influence, or the status to get past someone like me. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, then simply shook her head and returned to her meal. The next morning, Davenport walked into the real estate office with the confidence of a king returning to his throne. He adjusted his cufflinks as he stepped inside, expecting to hear more about how his decision had stood firm, maybe even an update on another appropriate buyer being lined up for the property. But the moment he saw Rebecca, the sales agent, he knew something was off. She was fidgeting behind the desk, avoiding eye contact, her usual polite smile replaced with something tight and uneasy. Davenport frowned. What's with the look? Did something happen? Rebecca hesitated. Well, sir, I just wanted to let you know A voice interrupted from behind. Congratulations on the sale, Rebecca. Davenport turned sharply. Another agent, overhearing their conversation, grinned as he tapped a document on the desk. The mansion closed this morning. All cash deal. Easiest transaction we've ever had. Davenport's heart skipped a beat. Excuse me. His voice was sharp, his composure slipping for the first time. Rebecca swallowed hard. It's sold. Just a few hours ago. Davenport's breath hitched. Who bought it? Rebecca's fingers trembled as she flipped through the paperwork. She finally landed on the name and looked up, her face paling. Davenport snatched the papers from her hands, scanning the name listed under property owner. His jaw clenched, his grip tightening on the paper. Shaquille O'Neal. Richard Davenport III stormed into the real estate office, his face flushed with barely contained rage. The door swung open with a force that made Rebecca flinch behind the desk, but she quickly straightened, schooling her features into an expression of professionalism. She knew this moment was coming. She had been preparing for it ever since she handed over the final sale documents earlier that morning. Davenport's polished Italian leather shoes struck the marble floor hard as he stalked toward her desk. This has to be a mistake, he snapped, slamming his palm down so forcefully that a small stack of property brochures fluttered to the floor. Rebecca calmly reached for the contract sitting neatly in front of her and slid it across the desk toward him. No mistake, Mr. Davenport, she said, her voice steady. The sale was finalized this morning. The property now belongs to Mr. O'Neal. Davenport's fingers clenched around the paper as his eyes darted frantically over the details. He searched for something, anything, that would give him an excuse to call the whole thing off. But there it was, in black ink, undeniable and absolute. The purchase was completed through an LLC, but the listed owner? Shaquille O'Neal. Davenport's lips curled in disgust. You people really let him buy into Silver Ridge? He spat, tossing the paper back onto the desk like it was contaminated. Rebecca met his glare with a cool, unwavering stare. She was done being intimidated. Mr. O'Neal met every requirement, followed every process, and paid in cash. He didn't just buy the mansion, he owns it. There's nothing you or anyone else can do to change that. Davenport's jaw tightened. He was used to being in control, used to getting what he wanted with a snap of his fingers. But this was a power move, one he hadn't seen coming. A few other agents in the office had taken notice of the commotion, whispering among themselves as they watched the confrontation unfold. Some exchanged amused glances. Davenport had made a habit of throwing his weight around for years, but this time he had finally been outmaneuvered. His fists clenched at his sides. He leaned forward, his voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. You think this is over? Rebecca didn't even blink. I think you're going to have to get used to having a new neighbor. Davenport straightened, adjusting the cuffs of his pristine suit, his expression darkening. He had built his life on exclusivity, on keeping people like Shaq out. If they thought he was going to sit back and let this happen, they were sorely mistaken. We'll see about that, he muttered, turning on his heel and stalking out of the office. Shaquille O'Neal leaned back in the massive leather chair inside his new mansion, sipping on a protein shake as he admired the breathtaking view from his floor-to-ceiling windows. The ink had barely dried on the paperwork, and already he felt the shift in the air, the tension, the resistance. Then, as if on cue, his assistant walked in, a crisp white envelope in her hand. This just arrived, she said, setting it down on the marble countertop. Shaq raised an eyebrow, grabbing the envelope and turning it over. The seal on the front read, Silver Ridge Homeowners Association. A slow smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. That didn't take long. Tearing it open, he unfolded the neatly typed letter and started reading. Dear Mr. O'Neal, welcome to Silver Ridge Estates. As a valued member of our exclusive community, we would like to remind you of a few important policies that ensure the integrity of our neighborhood. All exterior modifications must be approved by the HOA. Loud noises, including music and parties, must not exceed 50 decibels after 6 p.m. A strict limit of 2 vehicles may be parked in any driveway. Additional vehicles must be stored off-site. No sports-related gatherings are permitted in driveways or front yards. Failure to comply with these community standards may result in penalties, fines, or further action. We trust you will respect the traditions of Silver Ridge Estates. Shaq exhaled sharply through his nose, a deep chuckle rumbling from his chest. Traditions, huh? He set the letter down and leaned back, stretching his massive arms over his head. This wasn't just about rules. This was a message, a warning. They couldn't stop the sale, but they sure as hell would try to make him uncomfortable. He pictured Davenport sitting in his overpriced mansion, smirking to himself, convinced this would be enough to push him out. Shaq's eyes darkened. "That all you got?" he muttered to himself. His assistant hesitated. "Should I draft a response?" Shaq grabbed his phone and tapped the screen, scrolling through his contacts. His smirk widened when he landed on the name he was looking for. "Nah," he said, pressing call. "Let's turn the heat up." As the phone rang, Davenport was across the street, sipping his morning coffee, watching Shaq's house with satisfaction. But his smug expression faltered when he saw Shaq through the window, grinning, phone in hand. Something told him he had just made a very big mistake. Richard Davenport III strolled into the Silver Ridge Estates HOA meeting with the confidence of a man who had never lost. He adjusted his cufflinks, nodded to a few board members, and took his usual seat at the head of the long mahogany table. The room was filled with the neighborhood's wealthiest homeowners, his allies, or at least they had been. Tonight they were here for one reason: to put an end to Shaquille O'Neal's disruptive presence in their exclusive community. Davenport tapped his pen against the table, smirking. "All right, let's get this meeting started. First order of business." The double doors swung open. In walked Shaq, not alone. Behind him, a team of 4 lawyers, sharp suits, polished briefcases, expressions cold as steel. The tension in the room shifted. Conversations hushed. Davenport straightened in his chair, his smirk twitching. "What the hell is this?" he scoffed. Shaq strolled forward, slow and deliberate, sliding into an empty chair at the table. His presence dwarfed everyone in the room. He placed a thick folder onto the table, tapping it twice with his massive hand. "You called a meeting," Shaq said. "I figured I'd come prepared." Davenport let out a short laugh. "Prepared for what? Another letter about community rules? You've been here 5 minutes, and you're already causing problems." Shaq didn't blink. "I did some digging." Davenport's smirk faltered. Shaq flipped open the folder. "Turns out, Silver Ridge Estates isn't exactly what you advertise it to be." He slid a paper across the table. "Illegal zoning practices." One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. Another paper. "Fraudulent fees disguised as maintenance costs." Murmurs spread across the room. "And this one's my favorite." Shaq leaned in, locking eyes with Davenport. "Turns out the HOA doesn't actually own half the properties it's been collecting fees from." He smirked. "Which means all those fines? Illegal." The board members paled. A woman near the end of the table cleared her throat. "Is this true, Richard?" Davenport's jaw clenched. "This is ridiculous. He's bluffing." Shaq's lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman in a navy blue suit, adjusted her glasses. "We don't bluff." She pulled out a thick legal document and dropped it in front of Davenport. "This is a cease and desist order, effective immediately." Davenport's confidence wavered. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Shaq leaned back, arms crossed, watching as Davenport's world unraveled. One by one, his so-called allies started shifting in their seats. A few cleared their throats. One man stood up. "I think we need to reconsider how we're handling this situation." Davenport turned red. "Sit down." But it was too late. His grip was slipping. Shaq smiled. "By the way, I'm not just stopping here." Davenport's stomach twisted. "What the hell does that mean?" Shaq stood, towering over him. "Guess you'll find out real soon." Richard Davenport III paced back and forth in his study, gripping a glass of whiskey so tightly his knuckles turned white. His world, his carefully curated, exclusive world, was slipping through his fingers. First, Shaq had outmaneuvered him to buy the mansion. Then at the HOA meeting, the basketball legend had exposed the corruption that Silver Ridge Estates had thrived on for years. But Davenport wasn't done yet. He had money, power, and connections. Shaq had won a battle, but the war wasn't over, or so he thought. That illusion shattered the moment his wife, Elizabeth, walked into the room, clutching a printed document. Her usually composed expression was gone, replaced with something close to panic. "Richard," she started hesitantly, "did you hear about the new sale?" Davenport frowned, setting his glass down with a clink. "What new sale?" Elizabeth placed the paper onto his desk. "He bought more land." Davenport's heart skipped a beat as he scanned the document. A massive plot, right next to his own mansion. His blood ran cold. "This has to be a mistake," he muttered, flipping the page as if a different reality would appear beneath the ink. Elizabeth swallowed hard. "It's not." Davenport clenched his jaw. "That bastard?" His mind raced. If Shaq owned the mansion, fine. He could tolerate that, barely. But this was something else. He stormed to his computer, pulling up the zoning records. What was O'Neill planning? A guest house? A sports complex? The answer came minutes later when an email notification popped up. Subject: Silver Ridge Community Project. Announcement. Davenport clicked the attachment. His eyes widened in horror. A community center. Not a luxury spa. Not an elite golf club. A public community center. Open to everyone. Elizabeth gasped, reading over his shoulder. Oh my God, Richard, do you understand what this means? Davenport's breathing grew ragged. Silver Ridge thrived on exclusivity. People paid millions to live here because of the carefully maintained barriers. If Shaq built this, their property values would plummet. Their carefully controlled kind of rich would be diluted. Their neighborhood would be ruined. Davenport's fist slammed against the desk. He's destroying everything. Elizabeth took a step back. Richard, maybe we should talk to him. Maybe there's a way to... Davenport whirled around, eyes blazing. Talk? He's doing this on purpose. He pointed at the screen. He wants to turn our neighborhood into a... He stopped himself, inhaling sharply. He turned back to the screen, rereading the proposal. Shaq had planned everything. He wasn't just winning. He was erasing Davenport's influence. The phone rang. Davenport snatched it up. His lawyer's voice came through uneasy. Sir, we have a problem. The city just approved Shaq's permits. Richard Davenport III had spent years building his empire. A world where only the elite thrived, where people like him controlled the gates, the rules, and the power. But overnight, his carefully curated kingdom was crumbling. His worst nightmare wasn't just happening, it was being broadcast to the world. He sat stiffly in his leather armchair, gripping his whiskey glass as the news played on the massive flat screen in his study. The Silver Ridge Estates logo flickered on the screen, right next to the face of the man he now hated more than anything, Shaquille O'Neal. NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal is making headlines again, not for basketball, but for breaking barriers. His newly approved community center in Silver Ridge Estates is being praised as a game changer, opening doors to families who never had access to this ultra-exclusive neighborhood. The billionaire stronghold is being forced to integrate, and not everyone is happy. Davenport's jaw clenched as the camera cut to an interview with a well-dressed woman, one of his former allies in the HOA. I was hesitant at first, she admitted, but Shaq's vision is incredible. He's bringing real change, and frankly, this community needed it. Davenport's grip tightened on his glass. His allies, his people, were turning on him. Then the ultimate humiliation. The segment cut to footage of a protest right outside Silver Ridge's front gates. Signs waved in the air. Welcome change. Let the people in. Shaq for mayor? Davenport shot up from his chair, his face red with fury. This is insanity. Elizabeth, seated across the room, sighed heavily. Richard, maybe it's time to... No, he snapped, whirling toward her. This isn't over. Elizabeth studied him for a long moment, then turned back to the TV. It sure looks like it is. The broadcast continued, but the next words made Davenport's stomach drop. Sources inside Silver Ridge confirmed that a group of homeowners is now pushing for Richard Davenport to be removed from the HOA board. Davenport's head snapped toward the screen, his breath catching. The next shot showed another familiar face, his longtime neighbor, a man who had always stood by him. Look, Richard did a lot for this place, the man said, shifting uncomfortably. But this isn't just about exclusivity anymore. The community's changing, and he refuses to change with it. Maybe it's time for new leadership. Davenport's vision blurred with rage. He felt like the ground beneath him was vanishing. His empire wasn't just crumbling, it was turning against him. Davenport's fist slammed onto the desk. I have to stop him! Richard Davenport III had built his entire life around two things: power and control. He wasn't just another wealthy CEO. He was the gatekeeper of Silver Ridge Estates, the man who decided who belonged and who didn't. For years, his influence had gone unquestioned, his authority absolute. But now, for the first time, he felt the walls closing in. Pacing in his office, he clenched his fists, barely containing his frustration. Every attempt to push Shaq out of Silver Ridge had failed. The Homeowners Association rules had backfired. The media had turned against him, and worst of all, the community he once commanded had started seeing Shaq as a hero. Davenport had spent his life crafting an elite, exclusive empire, and now a single man was threatening to undo it all. But he wasn't finished yet. He had one last move, and if played right, it could turn everything back in his favor. With a sharp breath, he turned toward his legal team. a group of highly paid attorneys who had gotten him out of countless messy situations before. "File the lawsuit," he ordered, his voice cold and decisive. "I want an injunction against Shaquille O'Neal for violating Silver Ridge community standards, commercial development without approval, breach of HOA policies, use every legal angle we have." Victor Langston, his lead attorney, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. A man known for his ruthless efficiency, even he seemed uncertain about this particular move. "Sir, we need to consider the optics. Suing Shaquille O'Neal is going to bring a lot of public scrutiny. He has the resources, the influence, and frankly, the people on his side." Davenport's jaw tightened as he slammed his palm against his desk, rattling the crystal decanter beside him. "I don't care about scrutiny. I built Silver Ridge. I make the rules, and I'll be damned if some retired basketball player thinks he can waltz in here and change everything." Victor sighed, exchanging looks with the other attorneys. "Very well. We'll file the case immediately." Davenport had expected the lawsuit to rattle Shaq, to force him into a corner, or at the very least, slow him down. What he hadn't expected was how quickly the move would backfire. The next morning, he sat in his office, expecting to see news coverage discussing the legal battle he had initiated. Instead, he was greeted with something far worse. Breaking news: Davenport Industries stock plummets amid lawsuit against Shaquille O'Neal. The headline flashed across the television screen, and Davenport's stomach lurched. A panel of financial analysts appeared on screen, their voices serious. "This lawsuit is an unforced error," one analyst remarked. "Not only is it a PR disaster, but it's also a major financial risk. Investors are pulling out, and as of this morning, Davenport Industries stock has dropped nearly 15%. Another expert chimed in. "It's more than bad press. Shaquille O'Neal is beloved by millions, and this lawsuit makes Davenport look like an elitist bully. Investors don't like backing the villain." Davenport felt his blood pressure rising as he grabbed his phone and dialed Victor's number. The attorney answered on the second ring, his voice calm despite the obvious tension. "Victor, what the hell is going on?" Davenport barked. "Why is my company's stock crashing over a stupid lawsuit?" There was a pause on the other end before Victor answered carefully. "Sir, the lawsuit is making investors nervous. We expected some backlash, but this is bigger than we anticipated. Some of our major shareholders are considering pulling out entirely." Davenport gritted his teeth. "Tell them I have everything under control." Victor hesitated. "With all due respect, sir." "Do you?" While Davenport scrambled to save face, Shaq did something unexpected. Nothing. He didn't fire back with press conferences. He didn't respond with statements. He didn't even acknowledge the lawsuit publicly. He just waited, and that silence spoke louder than any words could. Social media erupted in support of Shaq, with thousands of tweets and posts criticizing Davenport's actions. Celebrities, athletes, and even corporate executives weighed in. "Davenport is scared. He knows Shaq is about to change the game. This lawsuit is a joke. Davenport just destroyed himself. Shaq is playing chess while Davenport is out here flipping the board." Davenport could feel his control slipping further with every passing second. And then, his office door burst open. His assistant, pale and wide-eyed, rushed in, clutching a tablet in her trembling hands. "Sir, we have a problem." Davenport turned slowly, his pulse spiking. "What now?" Richard Davenport III had always prided himself on being untouchable. He had built his empire with ruthless precision, forging alliances with the wealthiest and most powerful figures in the industry. For decades, his influence had been absolute. But now, sitting in his office, watching his world collapse in real time, he felt something foreign creeping into his bones. Panic. His assistant stood frozen at the door, gripping the tablet as if it carried a death sentence. Davenport's fingers curled into fists as he forced himself to stay calm. "Spit it out," he ordered, though his voice betrayed a hint of desperation. She swallowed hard, eyes darting between the screen and her boss. "Your stock, it's down another 20%. Investors are pulling out by the minute. And," she hesitated, "sir, the bank has frozen your assets." Davenport's heart slammed against his ribs. He shot up from his chair, nearly knocking over the glass of scotch on his desk. "That's impossible," he growled. "I have liquidity. I have reserves." His assistant shifted uncomfortably. "Not anymore. The board called for an emergency meeting. They're looking to remove you as CEO. Sir, they're saying you're—" She hesitated again. "Say it." "They're saying you're a liability." Davenport felt the room spin. Just days ago, he had been on top of the world, dictating the fate of Silver Ridge Estates. Now his own empire was crumbling beneath him. Get Victor on the phone. Now. She nodded quickly, dialing his lead attorney. Moments later, Victor's voice came through, calm but firm. Richard, I was about to call you. Cut the crap. What the hell is happening? Victor sighed. The lawsuit backfired worse than we expected. Your board is in full panic mode. And Richard, another pause. Your mansion is on the market. Davenport nearly dropped the phone. He gripped his desk for support. What did you just say? Victor's voice was almost sympathetic. Your frozen assets triggered a forced liquidation. The bank put your property up for sale this morning. Davenport felt a cold sweat trickle down his neck. His mansion, his pride and joy, the very symbol of his power, was being sold out from under him. He inhaled sharply, forcing himself to think. He could still recover. He could leverage his remaining connections, pull favors, salvage something from this disaster. Fine, I'll buy it back myself. Silence. Then his assistant let out a nervous breath. Sir, there's already a buyer. Davenport's blood ran cold. Who? She hesitated as if reluctant to deliver the final blow. Then she turned the tablet toward him, showing the official purchase record. His vision blurred as he read the name. Shaquille O'Neal. His breath hitched. You're joking. The assistant shook her head. I wish I was, sir. Richard Davenport III sat motionless in the driver's seat of his luxury car, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His world, his legacy, had just been ripped away from him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Through the windshield, he watched as Shaquille O'Neal stepped out of a black SUV, his towering frame casting a shadow over the grand estate that had once been his, the estate that now belonged to Shaq. Davenport's chest tightened. This wasn't just a house, it was the pinnacle of his success, a symbol of his dominance over Silver Ridge Estates, and now he had been exiled from his own kingdom. Shaq, dressed casually in a tailored black suit with sunglasses perched on his face, strolled up the front steps. A real estate agent handed him the keys with a wide smile, as if she enjoyed watching this moment unfold. Davenport seethed. Just days ago, he had been the one pulling the strings, deciding who was worthy of living in Silver Ridge. He had controlled this community like a personal empire, making sure men like Shaq never set foot inside. But now he was the one sitting outside the gates, unwelcome. Shaq turned as if sensing Davenport's presence. Slowly he removed his sunglasses, revealing that signature, confident smirk. He took his time, letting the moment stretch, enjoying the poetic justice of it all. Then with an easy, unbothered grin, he said the words that shattered whatever pride Davenport had left. Welcome to the neighborhood. Davenport's jaw clenched. His fingers twitched, as if ready to punch the dashboard in frustration. But he knew the truth. He had lost. Shaq turned away, walking through the grand entrance of his new mansion, the door closing behind him with a finality that sent a clear message. Richard Davenport III was officially out. Davenport stared at the massive estate that had once been his, the reality sinking in. Silver Ridge wasn't just changing, it had already changed, and there was nothing he could do about it.